Welcome and thank you for joining us. My name is Laura Bryant. This is another program in Merowith Center's highly popular Presidential Legacy series. So far, we have featured 6 presidential libraries: Lincoln, LBJ, Truman, FDR, Carter, and Ford. This morning, Richard Weld, Education Specialist at the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library and Museum, is covering part 2 of our 3-part series highlighting President Ford and his wife, First Lady Betty Ford. Last month, Richard kicked off part 1, the early years. Today is part 2, the DC years, when things get really interesting. And part 3, after the White House, will be held next month on Thursday, April 25th. Thank you, Richard. We're very happy to welcome you back to the Merowith Center. We're all very eager to hear more about the Fords and how their political and personal legacies continue to resonate. Thanks.
Well, it's my pleasure. Is my screen showing up properly?
Yes, it is.
As soon as you started recording, I accidentally closed the slideshow, so that was perfect timing. All right, well, everybody, as I mentioned a moment ago, we're going to cover about 28 years in about 45 minutes, so strap in. It's going to be a fun ride. For those of you who were here last time, we left off in 1948, just as Jerry and Betty got married and moved to Alexandria, Virginia. That was October 15th, 1948, when he gets elected. Jerry takes his work very seriously. He reads quite a few papers, listens to the radio, and studies up on everything he didn't already know. This is a great picture we like to share with student groups to ask them, okay, what are those things he's holding? Yes, you recognize the book. Those are called newspapers. Can you identify the thing on the table next to him? No, it's not a toaster. So we have a good time explaining radio to young students. But he takes to his duties very seriously. He likes to have every letter or telegram returned within 48 hours, with the exception of the occasional oddball letter that he gets, but he's very serious about serving his constituents. In the meantime, Betty assumed all of the tasks of a congressional spouse of the era, which involved spending a lot of her time in volunteer work with the Congressional Wives Club or the 81st Congress Club. She's also a member of the National Federation of Republican Women and provided tours of the Capitol visiting constituents from Michigan. So they settled in 48, and he wanted to become a public servant. He wanted to do this for his country. So there was always a lot of campaigning involved and so on. But he actually excelled in Congress. He was quite popular in the field. This is one of his statements that he sent out later on when he becomes House Minority Leader. But he becomes a member of the House Appropriations Committee in 1951. His degree from U of M was actually in economics. And he rose to prominence when he joined the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee. He eventually became its ranking minority member in 1961. So Jerry spent his time in Congress learning how the budget worked. This would serve him very well later when he becomes president. He really mastered the concept of how the federal government moves money around. But he earned a reputation for being bipartisan. His goal was to have America work properly, and he would work across the aisle to do that, no problem. He earned a lot of trust with the Democratic Party. In January of 1965, he becomes the minority House leader, and he aims to become the Speaker of the House. Now, that would involve the Republicans taking the majority in the House, and that it was not going to happen anytime soon, unfortunately for him. But he played on the congressional baseball team, using all of his sports expertise. He hit the first Grand Slam home run in the Congressional League. So we've got nice, great pictures of him doing that. He, on the other hand, though, spends about 200 days a year on the road, returning to Michigan for most of those, but occasionally traveling the country campaigning for other politicians and such, including a guy he knows who works down the hall from him by the name of Richard Nixon. That comes up later, but they become friends early on. But yeah, he spent a lot of time out on the road. So meanwhile, in Alexandria, Virginia, the Fords become the proud parents of 4 kids. Michael Gerald, who's born in March of 1950, John Gardner, who's born in March of 52, Stephen Meigs, born in 1956, and Susan Elizabeth, born in 1957. So they have adorable children. And they take parenting seriously. But this is difficult for Betty, of course, because of Jerry's many, many trips. As often as possible, he does try to do these trips in one day, showing up at the airport at dawn, flying out to Michigan, pressing the flesh, doing a luncheon, doing meetings, doing a dinner, flying back to DC, and sleeping in his own bed. But Betty does hire a full-time housekeeper just to help her run the home, because he is on the road a lot. We have his travel records, which are fascinating because you can watch his itinerary, and sometimes it's, okay, you're going to get here. You have 5 minutes to change your clothes before the dinner. Go. So, as we probably all know, in November 17th, 1972, Ford gets elected to his 13th consecutive term in the House of Representatives. At this point, he's pretty sure he's never going to become Speaker of the House. So he considers retiring in 1976, and he and Betty decide that's going to be it. He's going to do 72 to 74, 74 to 76 if he gets reelected, and then he's done. Well, this was under President Nixon, who also got elected in 72 and then ran into a few problems, the first of which was named Spiro Agnew. Spiro Agnew was the vice president under Nixon and had to admit to some tax evasion and maybe taking a few bribes. And he had to resign. Now, it's quite uncommon for vice presidents to resign, but Congress gets to vote essentially at whatever vice president candidate the president then puts forward. And one of the things they said, and they made it quite clear if you see this article, opposition is hinted if choice is possible 1976 candidate. The Congress, again, Democrat-controlled House, was not going to pass anybody they figured was going to be Nixon's VP and then run for president in 76. So they batted around a bunch of names and they thought about it. And Nixon puts forward Ford as his candidate. Everybody likes Ford, and nobody thought he would ever want to be president, which was correct. That was never on his list of ambitions. So the FBI began the most thorough background investigation they had ever run up to that point. Normally, when someone runs for president, they're vetted by all sorts of things. When somebody's on the ticket as vice president, they get vetted for all sorts of things. They spend so much time in the public spotlight that it's hard not to know about them. But here's this guy who just comes out of nowhere and suddenly he might be vice president. So there was a huge amount of looking into him. He released financial records and all of these other things. Well, after several months, it was actually December 6th of 1973, Ford takes the oath in front of Congress and becomes vice president of the United States. He figures he's going to serve out the last year, two and a half years, essentially, of the Nixon presidency as VP. No problem. Well, then Nixon resigns. It became clear as things went along that Nixon had been involved in the Watergate scandal and cover-up. So Jerry had been very careful since the time he became VP not to get entangled with Nixon's problems. He did point blank ask Nixon if Nixon knew anything about Watergate, and later on says, I should have known he was lying to me, but, you know, I try to give him the benefit of the doubt. So Ford walked a very fine line between backing the president's policies and staying clear of the Watergate scandal. But as 74 rolled on, it became more and more clear that Nixon was involved and was going to have to do something. So on August 9th of 1974, President Nixon resigns and Gerald Ford becomes the 38th president of the United States. Now, funny thing about this, Jerry was vice president. There was no vice presidential mansion yet. They were actually preparing number 1 Observatory Circle to become the vice presidential home. But at that point, Jerry and Betty were just living in their place in Alexandria. Well, now he's president, and he's doing all of his press things from his front lawn, which had to have been great for the neighbors. The Secret Service has taken over his garage and made it their command center. Nixon and their family got out of the house fairly quickly. I'm sure you all recognize the picture of Nixon getting on Marine One and flying away. But there's actually a process to flip the White House for the next president. And so President Ford spent the first couple of days of his tenure living in Alexandria, and that had to have been real great for the neighbors. Little bit of a Secret Service presence there. So he takes his oath just down the hall in the White House, nothing doing on the Capitol steps, et cetera, and becomes president of the United States. Normally, a president is given 100 days of grace period when they start out. They talk about the first 100 days. What is the president going to do in the first 100 days? Well, Jerry got 30. Everybody needed to know right away what he was going to do. As soon as he swore the oath of office, he got right to work. In the first few weeks, he met with the ambassador from every country in the world. Some of them were individually, some of them were in groups. This is Latin America here. He just brought them all in, sat them down, and assured them that America's, as a nation, as a concept, was still functional. There was a lot of concern in the world about continuity of government, and he had to bring everybody in and say, no, I'm the president, we're good, we're rolling. This was also the theme of his speech to Congress on August 12th. He assured them that he wanted to work with them to solve America's problems and clear out the current crises, because he had inherited a tough load of paperwork here. So he set to work, and his policy was great transparency. Nixon, by the end of his term, was angry with the press, angry with his opponents, had an enemies list. He did not do anything publicly. There are lots of complaints about that with Nixon. So Jerry actually did things like open air bill signings right outside on the White House lawn, invited all of the press and all sorts of special guests and anybody who was involved to watch him sign whenever he signed a bill. He was extremely transparent because he had to respond to the legacy of his predecessor. That was a very popular policy. Shows up in a lot of news media. Not everything he signed, however, was. Still in his first 30 days, he offered clemency to draft dodgers who had fled the United States, usually to Canada, instead of serving in Vietnam. Now, he did not pardon them. That actually came under Carter. But what he did was he said, here's what you can do. You can come back. We won't prosecute you. You can do some service, and you can be in America again. This offended as many Americans as it pleased. It was something he thought was necessary for the country, something to bring these young men home and, get us back working together again. Well, on the last day of his 30 days, he reversed that math by pardoning Richard Nixon on September 8th. That pleased as many people as it offended. So in the first month of office, he reassured the rest of the world that America is still a country, and then he offended the right, and then he offended the left. Jerry did not start out a very popular president, but as far as he was concerned, he was making the right choices for the nation, and we needed to eat our vegetables. Unfortunately, there was another crisis, and this one was a more personal one. About a month after they took office, well, he took office and they moved into the White House, Betty was diagnosed with breast cancer. It was late September 1974, just after, they've moved into the White House. And social conventions were that you didn't discuss cancer, and certainly women did not discuss breast cancer. She immediately broke those social conventions by fostering public discussion of her diagnosis and of her treatment. Everything happened, as with Jerry's legal things, above board and in the public. With her cooperation, a complete account of everything from her diagnosis to her operations appeared in Newsweek magazine. In doing this, she purposely raised public awareness of screenings and treatment options, and then reassured a lot of the people who were already suffering from similar situations. In addition to a large public swell of support for the First Lady, record numbers of women began actually having breast examinations they were skipping. Many of women had them for the first time. Now, the incidence of breast cancer diagnoses rose by 15%, But on the other hand, it meant these people were able to get treatment instead of having it show up too late. So she went through the whole thing in public. She got back to the office. Everybody missed her. It was very sweet. But then she continued to campaign and raise awareness for the rest of her life. She went through everything publicly and with great candor, and, went back to the White House, but kept campaigning for screening, for testing, for diagnoses, and for the fact that there can be good outcomes. So this really helped with the president's, open air, put some sunshine on everything policy. Unfortunately, going back to eating vegetables, in the mid-70s, the American economy was not super great. Inflation, when he took over, was 10.86%. Unemployment was 5.5%. Those are terrible numbers that even now, when we talk about our unemployment and our inflation, those are horrifying numbers. So he launched a campaign called Whip Inflation Now. It was called WIN. Modeled after the home front campaigns of World War II, it was meant to mobilize the American public to plant gardens, conserve, and fight inflation. And there was a lot of merch for it. So many buttons, so many flyers, so many posters. One of our favorite artifacts, somebody knitted a sweater for Jerry and sent it to him at the White House. And yes, we have pictures of him wearing this sweater at official functions. Because if some constituent was going to send him this sweater, by God, he was going to get himself photographed in it. The WIN campaign did not meet its goals, and it's widely regarded as a failure. But by the end of Jerry's 3-year presidency, inflation was down to 4.6% from 10.8%. That's not bad. The flip side, however, is that unemployment went up from 5.5% to almost 8%. That wasn't necessarily because of inflation, but there were additional economic struggles the country was having. Several larger U.S. cities had been overspending, and among them, New York City faced bankruptcy. Well, they reached out to the federal government for a bailout, and Jerry said no. He didn't say drop dead, but that was the headline. He basically said no handouts, no help until they implement major financial reforms. They had to cut costs, they had to cut spending, all sorts of things. Eventually, it worked out. But he also said government spending is out of control. Now, he's a Republican, so he likes lower government spending. Ford generously used the presidential veto power on 66 congressional bills. Now, once the president vetoes something, it goes back to Congress, which again, Democrat controlled, and then they can overturn the veto. Well, they only overturned 12 of them. And when he sent something back, he was vetoing it basically because of the spending. He said, if you lower this, if you cut that. He didn't just veto something and walk away. He said, here's why I vetoed it. And if you can do this, let's try it again. I want to cut spending. The net effect of this was trimming about $41 billion in federal spending over 3 years. It's not bad for the 1970s. Now, many Americans supported this use of the veto power and actually encouraged him and wrote him letters and said, please veto this one, veto that one. On the other hand, he sort of got a reputation for it, and it became a theme of opposition to his presidency. And we have this nice little campaign button from 76, veto Ford. That'll show him. But, it worked out okay in the end. The economy wasn't great, but came along. Other problems he was facing that he inherited. Again, he inherited the economy, inherited Vietnam and the Cold War. Well, the Vietnam War outlasted Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon, but ended under Ford's watch. And it didn't end well for us, certainly. North Vietnamese forces, backed by the Soviet Union, pushed the South Vietnamese forces, backed by us, further and further, until in April of 75, the war was clearly lost and Saigon fell. Ford had to pull out all U.S. presidents out of the country, but he felt that we had a responsibility to go one step further than that. He went to Congress to ask for humanitarian aid to pull out the many South Vietnamese who had helped the U.S. and who were looking to face persecution from the communist-backed North Vietnamese once we left. Congress refused at first, but Ford was pretty solid and eventually received funding to evacuate about 120,000 refugees. I'm pretty sure most of you have seen this picture before. This is folks climbing up the stairs to get on the helicopters out of Vietnam, right? Well, fun fact, we actually have those stairs here at the museum. When the US got back into Vietnam, somebody bought the stairs, shipped them over, and we have them on display with about the front 4 feet of a helicopter sticking out of a wall. So it makes a nice little panorama. But in the process of this, they also said there are a lot of orphans here in Vietnam, and we would like to get them out. And this was very controversial, but it was called Operation Baby Lift. And they removed about 2,000 orphans, and Jerry and Betty met the first plane. So Jerry got, you saw him earlier holding a bottle for one of his kids. Here he is again, being a good daddy. But a lot of these folks actually settled in Western Michigan, where I'm at, because when they were asking for people to adopt orphans from Vietnam, Jerry had a big fan base and contact base in Western Michigan, and a significant number of them wound up here. So I can always find a good, bowl of pho when I'm looking for one. Anyway, the end of the Vietnam War was not the end of the Cold War, by far. Ford came in near the end of that one, sort of, but he didn't get to start or finish it. Instead, like a good football player, he just sort of moved the ball down the field. And he did that in 2 big ways. In 1974, he traveled to Vladivostok to meet with General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev about the SALT II Treaty. And this one, Ford did a lot of the negotiation, did a lot of the groundwork, pushed it forward, but it was actually signed by Carter. This is how our Cold War worked. With presidents turning over, they all just had to keep moving the ball down the field. So they had a good time in Vladivostok, but they actually had to have their meetings out in the middle of the street because all of their rooms were bugged. So luckily, Ford had a friend give him a big wolfskin coat, and he had picked up one of those big fuzzy Russian hats. You can just barely see him there in the Russian hat, sort of towards the right of the group. We would like to display the wolfskin coat here at the museum. We actually have to have a replica because on the last day of their visit, Brezhnev sort of knowingly commented, "My, that's such a nice coat. What a great coat you have." And Ford gave Brezhnev the coat. But doesn't he look happy in his new coat? It's just adorable. We have to have a replica because somewhere over in Russia, there's a wolfskin coat with Jerry's name sewn into it. Anyway, he and Brezhnev actually became friends. They talked about football. They talked about cold weather, be it in Russia or in Michigan. And that friendship was strong enough that it survived when, despite the objections from a lot of advisors and Republicans and Democrats, Jerry actually signed the 1975 Helsinki Accords. These were fairly controversial. It was an agreement between the Soviet Union and a lot of other nations, including the US. It was not popular, but the Accords held the USSR to respect the sovereignty of nations and say, okay, we have to respect that other nations are other nations and we can't just take them anymore. And that it also lowered barriers to cultural and economic cooperation, helped bring down the Iron Curtain a bit, and it required the Soviet Union to recognize human rights. Ford viewed these as essential to bringing the Soviet Union to its knees eventually, and history leans towards supporting that view. It just was seen sort of as capitulating to the Soviet Union, but he looked at it as a compromise that was good for the country. As you may have noticed, a lot of the things Ford did, he thought were important for the country. A lot of people disagreed, and they didn't help him politically. Well, he had never asked for the job, but he was going to do it to the best of his ability. No, unfortunately, we haven't talked about Betty nearly enough. Let's talk about Betty. We love Betty. Betty was amazing. Betty was a dynamo of a first lady. The role of first lady has never really been defined. what the First Lady does. Well, she had no intention of being a quiet and discreet wife. Now, the First Lady is described often as the entertainer-in-chief, and she did that, hosting things like the White House Christmas party and getting a hug from Big Bird, because who doesn't want to hug Big Bird? But she also sought out contemporary and diverse acts to appear at their state dinners. Here she is dancing with Tony Orlando of the group Tony Orlando and Dawn. So they had to do a lot of state dinners during the Ford presidency because they wanted to bring over all of the diplomats and say, yes, America's okay. We're fine. It's cool. We got this. Constitutional crisis, yes, but we've moved forward. Well, interesting fact, this is actually the first time that well, technically second, but the Emperor of Japan came to the United States and did dinner at the White House. Previously, the Emperor of Japan had passed through Alaska during the Nixon presidency for about an hour and 18 minutes. And Nixon and Richard and Pat Nixon flew to Alaska to meet the Emperor. But Jerry had gone to Japan earlier in his presidency, and then the Emperor and Empress came to the United States and actually spent like a week and a half, including dinner at the White House. So these White House state dinners were truly important, and Betty made them really memorable affairs. On the other hand, she's also a bit of a practical joker. Behind the scenes, she liked to lighten the tension. So dressing up a skeleton for Halloween and leaving it in the president's private study was a thing. She had a great sense of humor. She actually did a cameo on the Mary Tyler Moore Show during the presidency in early 1976. Meanwhile, while all that was going on, she actually had a lot to say politically. She was working tirelessly in support for women's rights. She talked to news organizations. She talked at events. She talks at conferences, standing up for the rights of women. In the 70s, you may recall, there was the Equal Rights Amendment. Well, Jerry received several letters from people suggesting that he rein Betty in, and he never even considered the concept. That was not his style. He applauded what she was doing, and he supported her in her work. So while she was being criticized for making calls to support the ERA from the White House, she had a personal line run into the White House and had her own phone. It wasn't on the White House switchboard. She used that instead. As she famously said in 1975, being ladylike does not require silence, and also does not require you to not tap dance on top of the cabinet room table. This was actually taken on the last day of the presidency, just before they left. Betty was all over the media. Betty was a sharp dresser. Betty was outspoken. And Betty was in touch with the times. In many ways, she was more popular than Jerry. So we get to 1976. They've been in the White House for under 3 years, and they have a sit down and say, okay, I feel like I should run for election, not re-election, because he'd never been voted for. Jerry's our only president who was never voted for as president or vice president, or I should say elected. So they have a solid talk. They had talked about him retiring in 76. They decided to give it a go. He's got a lot of things stacked against him because he was unelected. Nobody voted for him the first time. And because he was following a resigned president, Nixon. No one had ever been in this situation before. This is him running for election, not re-election. He had offended a lot of people by pardoning Nixon, mostly on the left. He'd offended a lot of people by offering an olive branch to the draft dodgers, mostly on the right. The end of the Vietnam War was a disaster not of his own making. So when he started out polling in early 76, he was trailing Jimmy Carter. 61 for Carter, 32 for Ford. It's about a 30-point trailing distance. Almost unheard of. Also, there was this guy named Ronald Reagan who decided to challenge him for the Republican nomination. That's pretty unique. Doesn't happen a lot. But because Ford had not been elected, Reagan figured it was a good time to go. All right. Well, the good news, It's 1976, the bicentennial. The country is riding on a red, white, and blue high. The president gets to do cool things like kick off the covered wagon train that's going to cross the United States from the East Coast to the West Coast, and he gets to stand in the wagon and wave a hat. He gets to do all sorts of cool things, host fireworks, host parties. All that's working for him. That's not bad. Also good news, he's campaigning against Jimmy Carter. Now, it's not good news because Jimmy Carter was a weak candidate. Jimmy Carter was a strong candidate. But the good news is that though they didn't see eye to eye politically, they were both serious about campaigning on issues. Sure, there were Buttons making peanut jokes about Jimmy Carter, and we actually do have a roll of Jimmy Carter toilet paper up on display in the exhibit. But that's as bad as it got. The two of them wanted to talk about issues and the economy and foreign policy. They didn't want to talk about each other and sling mud. But the best news that Jerry had going for him was Betty. Betty was way more popular than he was. Her CB radio handle, she actually got on CB radio, if you remember the 70s. That was the social media of the day. She campaigned for him as First Mama, which became a national success. Everybody loved it. This is actually earlier on than in the campaign, but I just love this picture. So in August of 1976, they have the Republican National Convention. Jerry narrowly beats out Reagan. And traditionally what would happen is Reagan would turn and support the chosen candidate. Well, Reagan took his support and went home and didn't rally for Ford. This may have been the last type of contested primary we had like that. Right up through the RNC, it hasn't happened in a while. So it's a rough campaign. The Republican Party is a little bit split. He's got a lot of things weighing him down, the economy and so on. And despite surviving the primary challenge from Reagan, he made a couple stumbles. In a debate with Carter, he misspoke himself when he said that the people of Poland weren't under Soviet domination. And he was never quite able to live that down. He meant that their spirit was unbroken, but the way he said it basically came out and said, yeah, Poland's not part of the Soviet. Oh, wait, hold on. Yeah, it totally is. So that was a problem. More amusingly, and this one cost him a bunch in the Southwest, he was at the Texas State Fair at one point, and somebody handed him a tamale to eat, and he bit right into it, husk and all. So people are like, you've never eaten. Okay, dude, come on. So that one made all the press in the Southwest. After a long campaign, he lost to Carter 50-48. Now, keep in mind, it started at 61-32. That means he brought himself up 16 points. After all of the difficult things he'd done for the good of the nation, knowing they were going to cost him, he almost pulled it off. So the family did a family picture in the Oval Office on the last day in the White House. And then they had a dignified transition of power. They rode to the Capitol building together to do the speeches. And Jimmy Carter actually asked him to stand up and acknowledged Ford during his speech right on the Capitol steps after being sworn in. He thanked Ford for getting the country back on track after Nixon. The two of them became good friends and actually became so close that they agreed that whoever died first, the other one would deliver the eulogy for him. They got along great. So Ford at this point basically retires to his home in Palm Springs, California, and his skiing cabin, such as it is, in Vail, Colorado. Those were the DC years for the Fords. They were tumultuous, extremely busy, and full of difficult choices for Ford. We like to think that it's a bummer that he lost, but if you have to losing to somebody as good as Carter is not that bad. All righty. Any questions, folks? That was a sprint through 28 years of history.
So Richard, maybe pull down your slides so we can see everybody.
Sure. Let's stop sharing.
Okay, Fran, you're up first.
Yeah, did he deliver? Did Carter deliver his eulogy?
He did indeed. And it was very touching. Tears to your eyes.
This was wonderful. Thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome.
So, Richard, I have a question.
Please.
I was going to ask the same question Fran did, because when you said that, I figured there must be.
Oh yeah,
to it, right?
Yeah, there'll be a picture of that, but not the whole speech in next session.
Right. So, do we have any other examples of that kind of handoff and partnership?
There are a couple, actually. Let me see. Truman actually leaned heavily on Hoover because after FDR died and Truman inherited the White House, the only other living president was Hoover. And he basically reached out and said, I have no idea what I'm doing. Because how do you take over from FDR?
Right.
And the two of them formed a good dyad. But there have been a couple of them. A lot of the ex-presidents they're in an exclusive club. When they do get-togethers, it's amazing how much they talk about, oh man, how much do you hate dealing with Ambassador so-and-so? Oh, Ambassador so-and-so. We have an assortment of pictures of the few presidential get-togethers that they actually have. And you know, they're among the few people who can understand what they've all been through. So they do sort of have a congeniality. Carter actually kept Ford briefed on foreign affairs so that he could actually pick his brain.
And once Carter was elected.
Yeah, once Carter was president, he kept Ford briefed so that he could be an advisor. A lot of presidents do tap other presidents for advice, suggestions, and hey, when you met with this guy, did you actually say this? Because he's sort of implying that you made a deal, but I have no paperwork on that.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it just seems so remarkable today.
Well, that's really because Jerry was all about the good of the country and not, I mean, he was a Republican, but that was second to him over behind the good of the country. Everything was second to behind the good of the country, even his own political future.
Yeah, he made decisions that were not self-serving at all.
He had so many advisors resign after he did things.
Right.
You did that? I'm out of here. I'm not going to be able to get you reelected if you keep doing these things. I'm leaving. Okay, fine. But I'm doing them anyway. Right. He did what he thought was right, even at the cost of his own political career. And I do remember 50 to 48. It's not bad.
I know. I do remember when he pardoned Nixon. It was so controversial. Controversial.
But he regarded it as he needed that off the plate so that he could work on things like inflation and unemployment, the economy, the Vietnam War, the Cold War. He needed to free up that time to fix the other problems. Plus, he personally viewed accepting a pardon as admission of guilt, which is not necessarily how Nixon viewed it, but that's how Ford viewed it.
Right. Yeah, I think the country was divided because there were obviously strong feelings that Nixon had escaped without repercussions. But I think my understanding, and I was obviously much younger back then, but I think Ford felt like he had definitely suffered repercussions. And the rest went
to visit him, and Nixon was actually in incredibly poor health at the end by the time he left the White House. And there was some concern he was not going to make it through the year. So Ford also was feeling a little merciful on that grounds.
Well, I'm sure the stress was awful for Nixon.
Oh, by the end of it, he was viewing the walls of the White House as barricades against the rest of the world. He did indeed have that enemies list.
Yeah, I know.
Fran's got her hand up again.
What was the percent that he lost to Carter?
It wound up being 50 to 48.
Thank you.
Which was down from 61 to 32. So he gained quite a few points there.
I don't remember watching the election on election night. I don't remember watching the results. Was it neck and neck through the night, or was it pretty clear what was going to happen?
It wound up being pretty neck and neck. There were some real things. There are any number of ways to think it could have gone slightly differently. If he hadn't pardoned Nixon, it would have gone differently. But even little things, the debate flub. I like to say the tamale incident was what cost him that one. That's right. That's it right there.
Mm-hmm.
But other people say he never quite was cool with Reagan not rallying behind him. A lot of Republicans that were Reaganites stayed home. And then Reagan, of course, has his moment in 1980 and takes down Carter.
Right.
So there was some real... He and Reagan got along just fine. I think Nancy and Betty had some issues. By which I mean they did not like each other at all. So, yeah.
I do remember Betty Ford campaigning for the ERA, and our hometown here in St. Louis, Missouri, Phil Schlafly, looking at the legislative effort or the amendment a little bit differently.
Oh yeah, yeah. Oh yeah. We have some letters from Miss Schlafly.
I bet.
The correspondence file about Betty, not just to Betty, but to Jerry about Betty, can be a very interesting place to do some reading. Do you know what your wife is saying? Yes, and I support her. So yeah.
And then are you going to talk in the next session? Are you going to talk about the Betty Ford Center? Does that come
very
back?
much so. That will be in the next session. The family intervention does not happen until after the White House.
Got it.
So we're gonna talk about the after the White House years next time. We're gonna talk about Betty's problems with alcohol and drugs. We're gonna talk about Jerry basically staying out of Carter's way and assisting where he can, and a couple of other things. And then we're going to talk about the National Archives and the museum and the library here.
That would be great.
Yeah. The rest of the story, such as it is.
Yeah. So does anybody else have any questions or comments? This is very interesting, especially in light. Yeah, thanks, Keith. He's applauding for you. Especially in light of how politics works today. I mean, the contrast is pretty stark.
It was a different game. It very much was. Jerry and Jimmy wound up political opponents, but also wound up being fantastic friends. There are a lot of things they didn't see eye to eye on, but they believed that the president's job was to do the best that he could by the country. And so, well, they didn't necessarily agree what that was. They agreed that each other's intentions were good.
Right. I was going to say they're fundamentally good people, both of them, and they recognize that in each other.
Yes. And it's always been a pleasure to be, working for the Ford Museum because we have such a fun president. Jerry had a good sense of humor. And, if it hadn't been the first year of Saturday Night Live and they were strapped for content, there probably wouldn't have been quite so many pratfalls pretending to be Jerry. Just to say, if you're walking down the metal steps off of Air Force One in the rain, wearing leather-soled shoes, which have no tread on them,
right,
and you've got Betty's arm in one hand and an umbrella for Betty in the other, and you're not holding the railing, and you fall down 4 steps, this should not have made international news, but did it. And then it became an entire season of Saturday Night Live. But
it made Chevy Chase's career too.
Made Chevy Chase's career. We have a picture from a conference they did here at the library after the museum opened of Jerry tripping Chevy Chase. It's staged. Chevy Chase has this huge smile on his face. But, Jerry's biggest problem with that was, I'm an athlete. I'm a jock. I'm not clumsy.
Right.
Later went skiing, and people were like, you can't go skiing, Mr. President. You'll fall down. He said, it's skiing. Everybody falls down. Yes, but it will make national news. He said, I don't care. I'm going skiing. It made national news. President falls again. Now, I think he was on like a double black diamond slope in Colorado when he hit a mogul and fell down. And people were like, oh, the president fell down. Yeah, I'd like to see you do that.
Yeah, the fact that he was skiing at all was pretty remarkable.
They actually had to get special Secret Service agents who could keep up with him on the ski slopes because he'd been skiing his entire life.
Mm-hmm.
Grew up in Michigan, a lot of skiing around here.
Right.
So yeah, he quite the athlete. Even so, if it hadn't been the first season of Saturday Night Live, he might have gotten that reputation.
And you're right. It was the fall of 1975 that Saturday Night Live started.
Yep. And so he actually played along with it, though. He sent his press secretary, Ron Nessen, to be on Saturday Night Live towards the end of that first season and play himself talking to Chevy Chase as Ford. And he actually did live from New York at Saturday night. They filmed it in the Oval Office and sent it over. And that was the bumper for that episode. The president saying live from New York at Saturday night. Didn't help. He's going to go down in history as a klutz. But we actually use on social media hashtag Jerry was a jock, just trying to fight that. Never going to happen. We'll never win that one.
I don't know. Time has a way of clarifying things. So
sure. We'll see. If that's the worst thing you can say about him was he was a little bit clumsy in public. Okay, we'll cop to that. Jerry Ford, the worst thing you can say about him, he was clumsy. Not really true.
He wasn't.
And he wasn't. So yeah, it's a tough to live down that reputation, but we'll manage. And I see something in the chat. Is that a question? Keith couldn't see the slides, but I think that got fixed.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Okay, if we're finished here, I'm just one more call for any questions or comments. We'll regroup next month and have the final chapter. Richard, again, thank you very much for joining us and spending some time with us.
Very much my pleasure.
This is many years ago, but it still feels pretty fresh. So very relevant.
Well, you all have wonderful days, and I'll see you all next month.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.